The day it happened, Corbin Merritt had $43 in his checking account and a permission slip on the kitchen counter he still hadn't signed. He'd meant to sign it the night before. He'd sat down at the table after his daughter fell asleep, uncapped the pen, and then just stared at it. Field trip to the Science Museum, $8. He'd stared at the slip for a long time before putting the pen down and going to bed. That morning, Noelle had found it unsigned on her way out the door. She was 9, and she'd learned not to ask twice about things like that. She just folded it into her backpack and kissed him on the cheek and said, "It's okay, Dad. It's not a big deal." That was the part that got him every time. The way she made herself small so he wouldn't feel worse than he already did. Corbin had been an electrician for 11 years. He was good at it. The kind of good that comes from caring about the work, not just doing it fast. He ran his own small operation out of a white van with a dent on the passenger door and a magnetic sign that said Merritt Electric, License D and insured. He had 4 regular commercial clients and a steady trickle of residential jobs, and on most months it was enough. On most months, but March had been slow. 2 jobs canceled. 1 client pushed payment to the following quarter. The van needed new tires before summer, and Noelle had grown 2 inches since September and needed new shoes for school, and the permission slip sat on the counter for 3 days before Corbin finally moved it to the drawer where he put things he wasn't ready to deal with. He dropped Noelle off at school at 7:48, the same as always. She waved at him from the front steps without looking back, the way kids do when they're trying to seem like they don't need you watching them. He waited until she was inside before he pulled away. The call came at 8:15. It was a commercial job, a lighting retrofit at a boutique hotel downtown, the Aldren. He'd done work there twice before, small stuff, and the facilities manager had his number. But this call wasn't from the facilities manager. It was from someone named Claudette Voss, and her title, she made clear within the first 30 seconds, was Chief Operating Officer. "We have an emergency," she said. "The ballroom's main electrical panel is throwing a fault. We have an event tonight, a private dinner for 60 guests, and I need someone here in the next 2 hours." Corbin asked her to describe the fault. She told him she didn't know what that meant. He asked if she could read him the error code on the panel to display. She told him she didn't have time for that. "Can you come or not?" she asked. He could come. The Aldren was a 12-story boutique hotel in the River North neighborhood, the kind of place with a doorman and a lobby that smelled like cedar and fresh flowers. Corbin had parked on the street twice before without issue. This time, a man in a dark blazer came out before he'd finished gathering his tools. "Service entrance is around back," the man said. Corbin didn't argue. He drove around, parked in the alley, and carried his bag through a gray corridor that smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet. The facilities manager, a quiet man named Henry who Corbin had worked with before, met him at the panel room and looked genuinely relieved to see him. "It's a ground fault on the ballroom branch circuit," Henry said before Corbin even opened his bag. "Started throwing at 6 this morning. We've had 3 sparks at the secondary junction. Any injuries? No, but we shut down the whole ballroom to be safe." Corbin worked for 2.5 hours. The fault turned out to be a combination of an aging junction box and a wiring error that had probably been sitting there for years, waiting for the right conditions to become a problem. He replaced the junction box, corrected the wiring, ran a full circuit test, and brought the ballroom back online panel by panel, checking each load as it came up. Henry stood nearby the whole time, watching, occasionally answering questions. At one point, he brought Corbin a cup of coffee without being asked. Corbin drank it cold because he forgot it was there. When it was done, it was nearly noon. Corbin packed his tools, wrote up the invoice on his phone, and printed it through the Bluetooth printer he kept in the van, a detail he was quietly proud of, because it made him look more professional than the size of his operation might otherwise suggest. The total came to $340. Parts and labor, 2.5 hours, emergency call rate. He brought the invoice to Henry, who walked it upstairs. Corbin waited in the service corridor. He could hear the hotel above him coming back to life. Carts rolling, distant voices, the sound of something being arranged. The ballroom would be used tonight. 60 guests, she'd said. He'd made that possible. He waited 20 minutes before Henry came back, and the look on his face was the kind of look a man wears when he's been asked to deliver news he doesn't agree with. "Ms. Voss wants to speak with you," Henry said. Claudette Voss was somewhere in her early 40s, with the kind of composure that expensive education and a few hard decades can produce. She was standing in the ballroom when Corbin walked in, holding his invoice in one hand and her phone in the other, and she was looking at the paper the way people look at things they've already decided to reject. $340, she said without looking up. "Yes, ma'am. That's parts, labor at emergency rate, and the service call. For 2.5 hours. 2 hours and 40 minutes, yes. She finally looked at him. Not with hostility exactly, but with the specific blankness of someone who has decided that the person in front of them is a problem to be managed rather than a person to be spoken to. "We have a contract electrician," she said. "For future reference. I understand. You called me because it was an emergency. I called Henry's backup list. That's different." She set the invoice down on one of the round tables that had already been dressed for the evening. White linen, little cards at each place setting. "I'm going to need you to resubmit this at our standard vendor rate. That's $90 an hour." Corbin looked at her steadily. "I don't work at 90 an hour. My rate for emergency calls is clearly listed on my website, and Henry had a copy of my rate sheet from the last time I worked here. Henry is not authorized to approve rate exceptions. I'm not asking for an exception. I'm asking you to honor the rate that was in effect when you called me." Claudette's expression didn't change. She picked up her phone, looked at something, set it back down. "I'm authorizing $170. That's fair market for a job of this scope. That's exactly half what I invoiced. That's what we'll pay." Corbin stood very still for a moment. There was a chandelier above them, one of the ones he'd brought back online that morning. He'd tested each of the 12 lamp circuits individually. He knew this ballroom's electrical system better than anyone in the building. "Ms. Voss," he said, "I'm a one-man operation. I drove here on short notice, fixed your emergency in time for your event tonight, and I need to be paid what I quoted." She picked up the invoice again, folded it once, and held it out toward him. $170. "Or you can pursue whatever channels you'd like. But I have 60 guests arriving in 8 hours, and this conversation is over." He took the invoice back. He didn't argue anymore. He'd learned something early in his life about knowing when a door was closed, and this one was closed. He walked back through the gray corridor and out into the alley, put his tools in the van, sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes without starting the engine. $170. For 2 hours and 40 minutes of emergency work that had saved an event she would charge those 60 guests several $1,000s each to attend. He thought about the permission slip in the drawer. He drove to the bank, deposited the check they'd sent Henry down with before he left. Because Claudette Voss was the kind of person who paid what she decided to pay and considered the matter settled. And then he sat in the bank parking lot and did the math on his phone. He still had jobs to schedule. He'd be okay. He wasn't going to be okay in the way he wanted to be okay, but he'd manage. He always managed. He picked Noelle up from school at 3:15. She climbed into the van with her backpack and immediately started telling him about a project her class was doing on water systems, speaking fast the way she did when she'd been storing up things to say all day. He listened and nodded and asked questions in the right places, and by the time they got home, she was laughing about something her friend had said at lunch. He made dinner. He helped with homework. He gave her a bath and read 2 chapters of the book they were working through together, a story about a girl who could talk to animals and kept getting into trouble because of it. Noelle fell asleep before the 2nd chapter ended, the book still balanced on her chest. Corbin sat on the edge of her bed for a while after she went under. The room was small and he'd painted it himself, a soft yellow that she'd picked from a paint chip at the hardware store. Very seriously, the way kids treat things they've been given real authority over. There was a drawing on her nightstand she'd made at school, a house with 4 windows and a garden and 2 people in front, one tall, one small. He hadn't been asked to sign anything tonight. That was the whole evening. He went to the kitchen and signed the permission slip and put $8 in the envelope they'd sent home for it and put it in her backpack. What Corbin didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that the conversation in the ballroom had not been private. The Aldren's ballroom had a small mezzanine level, a narrow interior balcony that overlooked the main floor, originally designed for orchestras, and now used mostly for storage and the occasional photographer at large events. There was a door at the back that was usually locked, but the facilities team had opened it that morning to run cables for the event, and it had never been relocked. A man named Whitfield Hargrave had been standing on that mezzanine. He hadn't been eavesdropping, not intentionally. He'd been up there because he always walked the space before events he cared about. Not to inspect exactly, but to look. He'd bought the Aldren 11 years ago as part of a portfolio acquisition and had never sold it, even when the numbers suggested he should, because he'd sat in the ballroom once at a dinner he'd attended as a guest and decided there was something worth preserving about it. So he kept it, and when he was in the city he checked in, and that morning he'd come in early and gone upstairs the way he sometimes did. He'd been looking at the chandelier, restored 3 years ago, the original 1940s fixture, when he heard voices below and stopped moving out of simple courtesy. He heard all of it. Whitfield Hargrave was 67 years old and had built 3 companies from nothing and sold 2 of them at figures with 9 digits. The third he still ran, a private infrastructure and development firm with projects in 14 states. He was, by most useful measures, extraordinarily wealthy, and he'd reached the age where wealth had stopped being interesting, and what interested him instead were people specifically, what they did when they thought no one important was watching. He watched Corbin work for a few minutes before the voices started. He watched him pack his tools after. He watched the way the man walked back through the corridor, not with anger, not with the slumped defeat of someone who'd been broken, just with the steady quiet of someone who knew how to carry something without showing it. Whitfield stood at the mezzanine railing for a while after Corbin was gone. Then he went downstairs and found Henry. "That electrician," he said. "Do you have his contact information?" Henry looked at him carefully. "Yes, sir." "What's his name?" "Corbin Merritt. He's been on our backup list for a few years. Good man." Whitfield nodded slowly. "I'd like his address, if he has a business address." Henry gave him what he had. 3 days passed. Corbin got another job, a panel upgrade on a residential renovation in Lincoln Park, 2 days of work, straightforward. He signed the permit, scheduled the inspection, finished on time. The homeowner paid immediately and without question. It was a good job and it helped, and he tried to let it be enough. On the 4th morning after the Aldren, Noelle was eating cereal at the kitchen table and watching something on her tablet with one earbud in. The negotiated compromise they'd reached about screen time at breakfast, when someone knocked at the front door. Corbin frowned. It was 7:30. He wasn't expecting anyone. He opened the door to find a man he didn't recognize standing on the small porch of his rental house. The man was older, silver-haired, wearing a jacket that looked like it cost more than Corbin's van, and he was holding a white envelope. "Mr. Merritt," the man said. "That's me. My name is Whitfield Hargrave." He extended his hand and Corbin shook it. "I was at the Aldren Hotel 4 days ago. I was on the mezzanine level when you spoke with Claudette Voss." Corbin looked at him. "I'm the owner of the property," Whitfield said. "The building. I own it." Several things shifted in Corbin's under simultaneously, but he kept his expression neutral. "Okay," he said. "I heard the conversation," Whitfield said simply. "All of it." A silence settled between them. Down the street, a dog was barking at something. Inside, Noelle turned up the volume on her tablet. "She made a call she wasn't authorized to make," Whitfield said. "Not because there's a policy against it. There isn't. But because it was wrong, and I've come to correct it." He held out the envelope. Corbin looked at it for a moment before he took it. It was unsealed. Inside was a check, and he looked at the number on it for longer than he meant to, because it took a few seconds to make sense of it in the context of a Tuesday morning conversation on his front porch. $38,000. He looked up. "That's your invoice paid in full," Whitfield said, "plus the difference she shorted you, plus what I'd call a referral premium for work I'd like to discuss. I have 12 commercial properties in this city. I've been looking for an electrician I can trust." He paused. "I'm told you've been on the Aldren's backup list for years. Henry says you're the best call he's ever made in an emergency." Corbin still hadn't said anything. He wasn't sure what there was to say. "I'm not here to make a story of this," Whitfield said, and his voice was quiet and direct in the way of someone who meant what he said and rarely needed to repeat himself. "I'm here because I was raised by a man who worked with his hands his whole life, and he told me once that the way you treat someone when you have all the power and they have none is the truest thing about you." He glanced at the envelope in Corbin's hands. "She failed that test. You don't have to." He handed Corbin a card, simple, heavy stock, just a name and a number, and said he'd wait to hear from him when he was ready. Then he walked back down the porch steps to the black car idling at the curb. Corbin stood in the doorway and watched the car pull away. He looked down at the check again. From inside the kitchen, Noelle called out, "Dad? Who was that?" He folded the envelope and held it at his side and went back inside. She was still at the table, cereal half finished, the tablet pushed to one side now because something more interesting had apparently happened. "Just a man from a job," Corbin Lawson said. "What did he want?" Corbin sat down across from her. He looked at her. The cereal, the tablet, the drawing she'd made at school, still stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a turtle, 2 figures in front of a yellow house. "He wanted to say something got handled right," Corbin said. Noelle considered this with the mild gravity that 9-year-olds bring to things they don't fully understand but sense matter. "That's nice," she said and picked up her spoon. Corbin called the number on the card 2 days later. Whitfield answered on the second ring, no assistant, no screening. They met at a coffee shop on Michigan Avenue, neutral ground, Whitfield's suggestion, and talked for an hour and 40 minutes. Whitfield explained what he was looking for, a primary electrical contractor for ongoing maintenance and emergency response across his Chicago properties, with the option to expand as projects came up. It wasn't charity, he was clear about that. He had vendors he'd worked with for years, and the ones he'd kept were the ones who showed up right, worked clean, and didn't cut corners. He was making room because there was room, and because he'd seen enough to know who filled a room well. Corbin asked questions, concrete ones: scope, timeline, billing structure, whether Whitfield had an existing maintenance schedule or was building one. Whitfield answered each one precisely and appreciated being asked. By the time the coffee cups were empty, they'd agreed on a framework. Not a contract yet. That would come from Whitfield's team within the week. But an understanding, the kind that's built on something more reliable than paperwork. Outside on the sidewalk, before they went their separate directions, Whitfield said one more thing. Claudette Voss no longer works at the Aldren, he said. It wasn't offered as a consolation or a punishment. Just information delivered the way he delivered most things. Quietly, as a fact. Corbin, I didn't ask for that. I know, Whitfield said. That's partly why I'm telling you. The contract arrived on a Thursday. Corbin read it twice, then sent it to a lawyer friend from his old neighborhood who now did business law, a favor he'd have to repay somehow. The lawyer called him back in 2 hours. This is fair, she said. More than fair. Whoever drafted it knows what they're doing and was trying to be reasonable. Corbin signed it that evening. He scanned it at the office supply store down the street because his home printer was out of ink, and emailed it back, and sat for a moment in the parking lot afterward. He thought about the $43, the permission slip, the check he'd finally deposited for $170 after 2.5 hours of emergency work that had made a rich woman's evening go as planned. He thought about Noelle, and the yellow room and the 2 figures in front of the house with the garden. He went to the ATM and took out $8 and drove to the school and put it in the envelope at the front office so the field trip was covered, and then he drove home to start dinner. Over the following months, the work changed. Not overnight, not in a single dramatic moment. It changed the way things change when the right conditions finally exist, slowly and then all at once. The Aldren job led to the Ridgeway, a mixed-use building Whitfield owned in Wicker Park. The Ridgeway led to a referral to a property management group that had 6 buildings in the northwest suburbs and had been looking for someone exactly like Corbin for exactly the reasons Whitfield had outlined. Someone who showed up right and worked clean. By summer, he had 4 part-time subcontractors and a second van. By fall, he had his first full-time employee, a young electrician fresh out of an apprenticeship named Tommy, who worked hard and asked smart questions and reminded Corbin a little of himself at 23. He moved the family, which was to say he and Noelle, into a house that was not a rental. 3 bedrooms, a yard, a tree in the back that Noelle immediately claimed as hers. She painted her new room herself with Corbin's help. She chose the same yellow. He ran into Henry from the Aldren one afternoon in October, on a job at a building a few blocks away. They recognized each other in the service corridor and stopped. "Heard things went well for you," Henry said. "They did," Corbin said. "Thanks for the kind words to Whitfield. He mentioned what you said." Henry shrugged, the gesture of someone who doesn't want credit for the obvious. "I just said what was true." They stood for a moment in the gray corridor with the smell of industrial cleaner around them and the sound of the city above. "She really thought that was fine," Henry said after a moment. Not quite a question. Corbin thought about Claudette Voss, her composure, the folded invoice, the chandelier he'd spent the morning bringing back to life while she slept somewhere in the building's upper floors. He didn't think about her often. He'd made a deliberate choice not to carry it. "Probably," he said. "Some people don't think about it at all." Henry nodded slowly. "Well," he said, "you do." Corbin picked up his bag and went back to work. The permission slip was still in his desk drawer, signed, stamped P8 in red from the school office's acknowledgement slip. He'd kept it without knowing exactly why, not as a trophy or a reminder of some low point, but because it felt true. Because it was the thing that was sitting on the counter the morning he drove downtown to a job that turned out to matter more than the morning suggested it would. Noelle came home from the Science Museum trip with a foam model of a water filtration system she'd made in a workshop and a sticker on her jacket from the gift shop and a story that took 45 minutes to tell in full. She'd sat at the kitchen table and talked, and he'd sat across from her and listened, really listened, and she'd stopped in the middle at some point and looked at him. "You're smiling," she said. "I'm listening," he said. "You're doing both," she said, and went back to the story. He didn't correct her.